So I'm going to talk about DANDI, which we don't just call it a data archive, it's a collaboration space. And I think I want to keep that theme in mind as we are here for this conversation. It's a project that's run out of MIT and Dartmouth together with Kitware and Catalyst Neuro as partners. It's supported by the Brain Initiative and also by the AWS Public Dataset Program. So for all of you who have questions about where to post your neurophysiology data, this is what I would point to, but hopefully I'll go through some of the elements of this. My usual thing, and this may be a question post the first session today, what if all the data in the world were instantly accessible? How would you think about it? I mean, some people might jump up and down. Some people will say it's useless. And there are many different ways one can look at data. And in the world we are today, and we might just stick machine learning models on all of it and pile and stir and stir and stir, and hopefully get some insight out of it. And that's a big hope at this point in time. So I want to think about talking about DANDI through the lens of 5 different elements: infrastructure, standards, computing, ecosystem, training. And along these 5 different dimensions, I want to consider availability of each of these dimensions. Discoverability. How many people here never heard of the word DANDI till they saw an email for this event? Anybody? Oh, that's a good sign. Maybe one person. It's okay to raise your hand. That's all right. But discoverability, and it's not just DANDI as an infrastructure, it's discovery on all of these themes. Usability. And you heard a little bit of this from Oliver's talk. We have to be able to interact with these things. And many of us have different levels of training on different fronts. So it's not always going to be exactly usable in the same way that we as developers might have intended it to be. So let's go through these one by one. So let's start with infrastructure. So as an infrastructure, DANDI sits in the cloud. It houses neurophysiology and other data sets. And at present, it has about 600 terabytes of data, of which about 400 terabytes is immunostaining data from Brain Initiative Cell Census Network. The neurophysiology data is still at about 200 terabytes, which makes it the largest source of neurophysiology data currently on the planet. And I won't go over this slide in depth because Oliver showed it earlier. It's been growing, and that brings about questions and challenges as to how useless this archive is as we move forward. I'm sure NIH would like to know how much it's used, how much it's going to be used, and that's why we are here. We want to understand how to make this useful to you. And standards was just one piece of that equation. So if you're a principal investigator, we allow any species of data, electrophysiology, optophysiology. Because of some interactions with the Brain Initiative, we also allow microscopy and human MRI, alongside behavior and stimulation data. Now, behavior might change as a new archive comes in, but for the moment, behavior is intricately tied to neural recordings in many experiments, and so they have to sit together somewhere, and currently we would support that. We're storing storage, dissemination, publishing, search, and more importantly, a research and collaboration space, and I'll go through some of these. I'm not going to go through the details of this, but the general idea is we have agreed to license everything CC BY or CC0, which is fully public domain for data sets lying in DANDI. And their terms and policies, these are modeled off of Zenodo, which is modeled by CERN as ways we have interacted and signed off by MIT's General Counsel because the actual project is funded through a project at MIT. So what can you do as a data submitter? Well, you convert your data to BIDS or NWB, 2 of the standards we support on DANDI. You've just heard about NWB. And then you might register a new DANDI set or a data set on DANDI. You can edit metadata. This allows you to increase richness at the data set level. Now, at the individual recording level, there's a lot of metadata, as you heard from Oliver, that goes into the NWB file itself. And that's where we would like you to continue to sticking that kind of individual session recording related metadata. You can use a set of tools to download the data, upload the data to the cloud, and finally, on the cloud, on the site, you can get to share that data, collaborate with others, add other people to it. And today we support both embargoed data sets as well as non-embargoed data sets, with embargo going alongside NIH policy, which means it has to be unembargoed with your first paper or publication that uses that data. Or the end of the grant, whichever is earlier. Being all academics in this room, we tend to know which one tends to come earlier. Okay. It also provides all kinds of things that are in the publishing world. So it's a data archive. It stores and publishes data. So you get all the things that you would get out of publications out of DANDI data sets, including DOIs that are minted for specific versions of data. But what if you were a researcher or a student wanted to look at DANDI as a source of data? So first, you can go and search for data. You can browse files. And you'll hear in a bit, I suspect from Jeremy, that you can interact with it as well in various ways directly in the cloud. You can download the data if you want to. You don't have to, but you can. You can go on the cloud directly into a Jupyter Hub and interact with the data on DANDI. So if you were looking for a local workstation-less experience, DANDI provides that for you. You can get data and do everything from your tablet or browser near you. Okay, and there's a bunch of places, I'm not going to go through details over here, that you can come to for help. We're here to help you get your data in the cloud and also to be able to process this data in ways that's meaningful to you. Okay. But we're just one part of a giant ecosystem for neuroscience. I've underlined in red some of the types of data DANDI houses. And this is complemented by a whole host of other biobanks and archives that the Brain Initiative has put together to try and get all of these pieces of neuroscience collected. And in that sense, I think of DANDI as a gateway or a node in a giant knowledge graph. We are interested in seeing how information connects to each other. And hopefully this set of archives, the set of tools that are being built, Andrea mentioned knowledge bases earlier, that are being built around it, will help us connect the dots, because we are interested in kind of thinking about how information in this space is represented, not just bits and bytes. Okay, talking of standards. I mentioned one of the things that we were asked to do was to house microscopy data from humans alongside MRI data. And this is one of the largest data sets on DANDI. But this does not come for free. I mean, the data set was being generated by a lab, but DANDI needed to adopt, extend, do certain things to make this work. So most people, when I say standards, think of data formats, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. There are data dictionaries that describe the data. There are identifiers that make information persistent. There are definitions. We need to be able to communicate information to each other properly. And finally, when none of these exists for a certain thing, maybe there isn't a consensus standard, and we go on to build one, right? Unlike this one, right? There are 14 competing standards. Ridiculous. I'll build a standard to rule them all. Now there are 15 competing standards. So in the context of microscopy, one of the things we did was we brought two communities together, the open microscopy community and the BIDS community. We did not need to create a new standard. We needed to bring a set of things together that work together to support these large microscopy data sets in a modern cloud-based system, which entail kind of going with OMESR as one of the elements that allows us to scale up microscopy data sets at scale, right? We can do various things with it. Computing. Often, we think about computing as we download data, we compute on it. Now, I'm going to make a statement over here. You guys can come to me back in 20 years and tell me if I'm right or wrong. The word download and upload will not exist in people's vocabulary in about 20 years. How many people here know the terms Archie and Gopher? Aha, and I think I can talk about people's ages through the notion of those terms. That was search before Google came along. Actually, in between there was Alta Vista and other things. But that's how people used to find information on the web. We don't talk about it that way anymore. And I suspect bits and bytes will be seamless in the world in about a decade to 2 decades. I'm going to give it 20 years. Things happen slowly. So we want to be able to deal with the kinds of data that Tim talked about, neuropixels. And we want to understand where we will house this, what we will house, and how we will compute on this. This is what it takes to move a petabyte of data, depending on your connection speed. And we're getting close to that kind of scale for a lot of things. Now, I would still say a petabyte is small, but that's me. But we have to deal with how we are going to access this, compute on it, and that requires storage formats, standards, being able to introspect, and pipelines and other things that operate on these things. We also have to keep in mind something like this. So this is CO2 emissions for training of various models. We are entering a world where this becomes a realistic thing for us to consider, given scale, storage of data, and all kinds of computing going on around it. So let's talk about data through a slightly different lens, through the lens of data levels. Now, often we talk about level 0, raw data, and that's where we have trouble with, right? Because that's the largest amount of data that's being produced, and how do we think about keeping that data? And I would say at this time, don't worry. Just put your data. We'll keep it for now. But what we need to discuss as a community is how do we get away from level 0? This is what communities like CERN have done, is they have decided what exactly they can keep from level 0 and what kinds of processes we can do to extract out other forms of information that is more useful for scientific insight than level 0. And if we start doing that, we suddenly will start spaces that we can deal with that's not the large amount of raw data that's produced. But we also heard in session 1 that no two scientists can agree on spike sorting. And we also heard that that agreement may not be required, but we as a community should decide that, right? We should figure out whether we want consistent spike sorting, or it does not matter at all if we get different kinds of spike sorting. But in general, we kind of move away from the raw data to more extracted information as we go up this hierarchy. And most people would say a publication maybe that sits on top of this is kind of the final form of that extraction. It's somebody's view of the set of data and the experiment and the design and the hypotheses and claims that were done in it. So in some sense, we have been doing that. It's just that the missing pieces and the raw data have been missing from our scientific discourse and existence because technology has been hard. We're here to say technology exists to do all of these things. We can start here at RAW's level 0 and then slowly as a community build out what we do for each of the steps as what to keep. Talking of the community and ecosystem, so BICCN and BICAN are ecosystems that have helped grow many of these archives. We have been working together, but it's not just BICCN. Oliver talked about the NWB ecosystem. There's a BIDS ecosystem. Overall, there are neuroscience ecosystems in place that we are interacting with that are defining how we standardize information, how do we communicate, how do we process these things more efficiently. For those of you who like to program, and that might change as well in the next 5 years, where you might just be talking to ChatGPT for everything on the planet, DANDI is a completely programmable archive. There's a RESTful API that allows you to interact with DANDI, and everything can be done from a programmatic mode. That's how we designed our archive. We built all our tools on top of that, which means if you wanted to come and create a better DANDI client because you don't like ours, feel free to do so. You're welcome, and we'll thank you. If you want to create a web app that looks better, you'll feel free to do so, and we'll thank you for doing so. That's growing the community. That's understanding how we create an ecosystem that allows us to interoperate across different things. And our API was step 1 in making that happen. Also, all DANDI sets are accessible without any of our clients and other things. They all sit on AWS S3. You can get it without using any of our tools. Our tools do make it simpler, but you can get the bits and bytes from there. They're also accessible to DataLad, which is a project that Yarek runs, which allows you to kind of create like a Dropbox mirrored shadow of the data set where you don't actually download all the bytes, but only get the bytes when you need to. Finally, if I ask people the word fair, probably all of you have heard of it because it's been announced in many, many talks, and Joe has it in his title for his Thursday talk. It also is complicated. FAIR requires addressing a lot of different components that most people don't have training over. One of the things that we can do as a community is how do we get that kind of training into systems, into education systems and other places. If we discuss this with scientists, all of them will say this is important. When it comes to executing them, to annotate data and doing other things, suddenly the science becomes more important than annotation. So we need to figure out a way where those two are not two separate things, but part of the same story. This is the world of large language models. So talking of training, there is a world evolving, and this is kind of our world today. Things evolve at very rapid pace. Keeping up with these things are hard, and this is again why we need a community and training to be able to understand what dissociates these things. Can we talk to each other about this? And this is again an example. I would say the same thing is happening in every space of science we interact with and deal with. We heard some fantastic sensors this morning, right? But somebody needs to keep up with those and see what those sensors enable for us to do. Jerome might talk about this, I'm not sure if he will, but this is something that he has been building as part of the Open Scope project in making people come to this ecosystem, to understand NWB, to understand the data that the Open Scope project is generating in NWB, and to give an example to people to be able to play with this. I won't go into more detail than that. I'm assuming Jerome will talk about this. So, what's next? We need curation, standards, and education. We often talk about quality control and quality assurance in many scientific processes. In the space of data sharing, that's about good curation, being able to add good metadata to your data, to be able to describe things in a way that others don't have to come to you to ask, can you tell me what happened there? That's the state we want to get to. It's hard, and it requires resources for us to do. Data and computational provenance. Well, right now there's a lot of lossy references. And for those of you, again, who know Archie and Gopher, probably also interacted with C as a programming language. And memory pointers, would disappear in various places in various ways. Right now, our world is something like that. We don't have strong links that go back and forth between the data, the paper, the design, the experimental design, the claims and hypothesis. But our technologies are getting to the space where we can do these things. So let's use this opportunity as a way of understanding how we can link across different spaces of data. Again, Oliver talked about HERD as an example of linking out to outside ontologies and external references. If we start doing that, it just increases the connectivity of the information we have. The third bullet here is of importance to us as somebody who runs an archive: sustainability and governance. We already heard about this growing scale of data. I'm assuring you right now that the current scale, not a problem at all. But I can see where those trajectories, I think we saw 3 graphs in this morning's talks, which had an extrapolation of where data could go or number of cells could go. So let's consider that and think about what should we be keeping, what should we be collecting, and what should we be processing. Finally, these data come from complex systems. We'll hear tomorrow about some of the science around these complex systems, connecting behavior and neural recordings. They also need to reflect diversity of systems. We are increasing the species component of DANDI, but are we capturing all the diversity and the variability that we want to capture across brain regions, disorders, and other things? Those are things that we have to keep in mind. And finally, you all are stakeholders in this mission. And I would love to know, what can we do to help you? And what can we do to help us get a richer and more vibrant neuroscientific and neuroinformatics space? With that, I'll stop and take any questions. Or one question.
Go ahead, Tim.
DANDI is free for now.
Yes.
But given the scope of things that we've heard about this morning, I can't see how it can stay that way. What are the thoughts?
That's a great question. So we're trying to approach it from a couple of different perspectives, including a completely distributed storage layer that goes across multiple institutions. Part of the challenge of this space is the kinds of process or computing that one might need to do on data. And hence the consideration of those data levels are going to become even more important. What do we do with data matters to how we store that information and how we access and compute on it. Again, at the current scale, I'm not worried. Ask me in 3 years, I'll talk about it. So just as an analogy, CERN generates about 25 petabytes of data per year. That's the final data that's stored. That scale is completely manageable. We are nowhere close to that scale at this point in time. So I would like to kind of think about us as ways in which we can, again, as a community, figure out those things. But worry, I don't lose sleep over it right this minute.
McKinsey?
Yeah, sorry, fantastic talk. I was just curious about how you're envisioning sort of the ecosystem of all of these different databases, which I guess as an end user also worries me. Like, how do I find the data? And if it's in Zenodo, it's in Figshare, it's in DANDI, it's in CRCNS, it's in Boston. So is there some level, I mean, maybe this is to the NIH, is there some level where we could have like a more high-level central repository so people can find things easily?
I think there's some conversations going on at NIH about this. Joe will be able to tell you more about those. But in general, NIH, the domain-specific repositories were good to kind of create a community around those domains. But every experiment we do today has become more complex and multimodal. So we are getting data that's generated across different archives, and right now they go differently to different archives. That's a conversation that we are having in two ways. One is, could an archive house multimodal data, right? Because it's relevant to somebody looking at that particular data set. And B, at that meta level, is there a knowledge space or search that gets you to those things? Both of those are happening, so I think I feel positive about this right now.